And Calvin Coolidge was a sort of a Taoist in that way. He believed that you could get things done by just being very quiet and not doing anything. Things would do themselves. And that's a sort of a theme in all through conservatism, that the self-organizing principle, that human societies have a capacity to organize themselves. They don't need a boss man organizing them. They don't even need an FDR with his legions of busy guys in white slacks, you know, the guy in the Grapes of Wrath movie, bossing everybody around. Human societies have a certain capacity for self-organization. And if you lose track of that, you're going to end up losing your democracy. So, yeah, I think when you look at the past, it's always foolish to think that you can recreate the past. But there are good things in the past that you can take from it and bring to the future. And the kind of restraint that we saw in Coolidge, I don't know about Theodore Roosevelt. I don't think the word restraint and Theodore Roosevelt ever occurred in the same sentence. But yeah, he had some qualities too that we could examine and perhaps adopt. You can't relive the past, and in many respects we wouldn't want to. There were many things wrong with Coolidge's America. But you can look at it and see what was good about it and try to preserve that. Trying to preserve bits and pieces of the past is most essentially what conservatism is about. Yep. Oh, Kerry.
John, what's your position on the middle class? You mentioned them before. It has always been my belief that there is no middle class in the world of conservatism.
What's my position on the middle class? I think its prospects are not good. Rather than just think on the fly here, I think I can just read a bit from my book, if I can find it while still filling the dead air. Let me see. Hold on. Yeah. Now, let me tell you something. I took my family to Hawaii for a vacation this summer, and I came back with one of those little digital cameras full of photographs, you know, like 300 photographs. So I took it over to the computer and dumped them onto one of those little flash memory thingies and walked it round to, what's the name of that place? It used to be Genovese. Rite Aid, yes. It's been through about 4 names, hasn't it? And I gave my little flash memory thing to the lady with all my photographs on. I said, I want prints from these photographs. She said, oh, just put it in the machine over there. So I looked, and there was a little USB slot, so I put it in the slot, and the screen lit up and told me to do things, and I did them. And then when I'd done them, it spat out a little receipt, and I just gave it to the lady. And she said, come back in half an hour. Now, even just 20 years ago, getting photographs developed, there would have been somebody it was pretty automated 20 years ago, but it wasn't that automated. There would have been somebody in a darkroom operating a machine, somebody with some level of skill to do that, and that person is now gone. Even, you know, supermarket checkout girls have gone, or they've almost gone. They've pretty much gone from Home Depot. I can never find one. Excuse me. So, here, I'm just going to read a little bit from my book. At my local supermarket, I usually check out at the automated self-checkout gadget. These things started to appear all over the place 4 or 5 years ago. I resisted using them at first, partly because I don't like gadgets. But I'm the last person in Huntington not to have a cell phone, which causes great distress to my publisher. Partly out of proletarian solidarity with the cashiers, whose jobs were obviously in peril from these things. But the convenience of it wore down my resistance, and now I use them more often than not. My economist friend, when I mentioned all that, told me about buggy whip makers. You see, once upon a time people drove buggies and they needed whips to keep the horses alert, and there were workers who made a living manufacturing buggy whips. And then along came the automobile, and buggy whip makers were surplus to requirements. So they got other jobs, my friend explained triumphantly. I suppose they did, but that was then and this is now. If low-skilled jobs are melting away before my eyes, which they are, what are these workers going to do? Does the fact that the buggy whip makers of 1909 got other jobs guarantee that the supermarket cashiers and C++ coders of 2009 will too? Isn't linear extrapolation of past trends into the future supposed to be the besetting sin of amateur economists? What is next in the series Farm, Factory, Office? What's the next term in that series? There isn't one. Now, I'm talking about supermarket cashiers there, but let me tell you, I spent this weekend in New York City at a conference called the Singularity Summit. Does anybody know what the singularity is? The singularity? It's an idea that some people have worked up about technological progress, that technology will soon progress to the point where we have machines just as smart as ourselves, basically. And after that point, all bets are off. Because if we can make machines as smart as ourselves, then they can make machines even smarter. And so then the exponential curve suddenly turns upwards and all bets are off. And that's called the technological singularity. And I was sitting at this conference for 2 days, listening to various speakers talking about the social and political and economic implications of all this. And thinking to myself, now it's supermarket cashiers who are out of jobs, but 10 years from now it could be doctors and lawyers. Actually, if you look at lawyers, I know something about lawyering, and what lawyers do, a great deal of it could be automated. You come to a lawyer with a case, and he could just key the details of your case into a huge artificial intelligence backed by an enormous database. The database would basically be just be all those shelves of books that you see and the photographs of lawyers in their offices, and work out a strategy. And there wouldn't be much for the lawyer to do. The lawyer would be like the girl at Eckerd. What is it? Rite Aid. The lawyer of that day, which is only about 10 years away, would be in the same relation to the lawyer of today as the girl taking my cash at Rite Aid is to the guy in the darkroom working that complicated machine. This is going to happen. I just spent 2 days hearing all about it. Believe me, it's happening. It's going to happen. The time scale at which it's going to happen is controversial, but it's going to happen. And when it does happen, there won't be much for the middle class to do. And that's awful. It's awful for people of my generation. When I grew up, everybody in America was middle class. You could work on an assembly line and be middle class. You can't work on an assembly line and be middle class now. In fact, there aren't any jobs on assembly lines anymore. It's done by robots, which brings us to the technology point again. So I fear for the middle class. I fear the prospect of an America 30 or 40 years from now, when my kids are in their prime years, and America has sort of cratered down into a sort of Brazilian mess. No offense to anybody from Brazil, but a sort of vast, unemployable underclass and a kind of semi-employable and again vast class of people who will work some of the time but depend mostly on government benefits, and a teeny tiny middle class and a few super duper rich people in their castles with legions of servants. And that's not the America I want my kids to live in. But I do think that's what we're heading for. So the short answer to your question is I don't hold out much hope for the middle class.
Well, I would just take it a little further and suggest that your hero, Ronald Reagan, is largely responsible for that happening when 22 of the last 30 years of presidential administrations in this country have been Republican administration, and arguably some of Clinton's years could be on those as well. That has contributed to the eradication of the middle class with the policies and the deregulation.
Well, let's share responsibility here, Kerry. We've also had some Democratic administrations in there too, and of course 8 years of a Democratic president as well. I'm not making a brief for the Republican Party. Rather the contrary, I'm addressing conservatives and saying, you guys have been getting it all wrong. You've been too optimistic. So you can't hang me on the Reagan hook. I do say some nice things about Reagan. He was quite a pessimist, actually, in a convoluted sort of way. I claim Reagan for conservative pessimism, with some qualifications. So it's by no means fair just to pin it on Reagan or even on Republicans. And even if it were, it doesn't demolish what I'm saying in this book.
If you could perhaps elaborate a little bit more on what you perceive as Reagan's pessimism. When I think of Reagan, I think of Cold War, we win, they lose, Shining City on the Hill, all that kind of stuff that I kind of thought was really optimistic. If you could elaborate on how you feel Reagan fits in with your pessimistic view, I'd appreciate that.
Well, first, just let me go back to what I said a little while ago about pessimism being for everybody. Anybody can be pessimistic. You don't have to have a face like this, or even a face like this. And there are some key ways in which Reagan betrayed a conservative spirit. For example, when the Marine barracks were attacked in Lebanon in 1983, Reagan pulled out. An optimist, whose name might be, George W. Bush perhaps, an optimistic conservative, would have sent an army in there to democratize the place. Reagan knew that couldn't be done. He knew there was no hope of that. He pulled out. And again, his record of vetoes is very good. I quote a passage from his diaries, Reagan's diaries, published a couple of years ago. Very, very well worth reading. One passage that struck my eye where he said, "Every pen I see looks to me like a veto pen." He wanted to veto things. And that, again, is the Calvin Coolidge spirit. Calvin Coolidge told his father, when his father was elected to the state senate, excuse me, I think it was, in Vermont, and he asked his son for advice, and Calvin Coolidge said, it's much more important to kill bad bills than to pass good ones. And if you look at the annualized rate of vetoes for the various presidents, Reagan scores pretty well. And again, at the end of his presidency, he was saying some pessimistic things about what he had been able to accomplish. He was comparing, there's a quote in the book, he's comparing the hopes that he came in with to what he had actually been able to accomplish. Sort of like, I forget the exact quote, it's 2 out of 3 ain't bad, something like that. But the real thing that he wanted to accomplish from his blessed conservative soul was to shrink the size of government, and that he could not do. And government increased across Reagan's term in manpower and in spending. Perhaps that's the real Reagan legacy. So I think I can fairly claim Reagan for conservatism. Now, he was president at a time when triumphalism could be excused. You could excuse some triumphalism. The Soviet Union was falling. We won the Cold War. And he was a naturally sunny person. He had a sunny disposition, which is no bar to being a pessimist. Yes.
Hi. I'd like your take on just the fact that any kind of dialogue doesn't seem to be readily possible between opposing viewpoints, or how much the media is really responsible for pushing its own kind of commercial agenda. But why is it, and I know throughout history there's always been, fights and whatnot, but now it's gotten to the level where it just seems that who's ever in the conservative movement or even on the left, that they just don't even acknowledge that that person has the right to even